Hello, Cape Town. We are Ensamble Studio, part of Ensamble Studio. Antón, García-Abril, and Débora, Mesa, sometimes the other way around. We bring you here our work, the work that we practice in Spain, between Spain and Boston.
We want to share with you our first emotions as architects, our encounters with the raw, still abstracted industrial landscape that is the source of our built environment, and how we learned how to deal with the tools, the people, the methods, and the technologies that given us our palette, our toolbox to operate as architects.
Yeah, we've always been fascinated by processes of transformation in landscape or industrial processes, and we've always had the need to learn about how to bring the power of those processes into architecture and to develop, in a way, an art of building that can then be transferred into the spaces that we inhabit every day.
And this is the power of design. Design starts with a spark of creativity and intuition, sometimes a dream, it could be a desire, but it's extended to the production, to the capability of the designer to embed this into a human need without losing any of the spiritual and human benefits that our work produces in society.
And the end product, the spaces, the architectures that these processes generate can be sometimes very different, but actually are the result of the same understanding of how architectural parts can come together to produce a space. And we will be presenting here a few works that are very meaningful for our practice, that have in a way planted a seed that is now being reflected in a lot of the other work that we are doing, and that we actually built ourselves as architects, as contractors, as builders. So in a way, they have become the prototypes upon which we think and we experiment.
So, off-site construction has to produce architecture without being embedded physical in its conception or assembly in the site. So it's a complete set of rules that changes the game of building architecture. So our first experience was about reinterpreting some of the materials of the game of prefabrication industry was giving us mostly for civil and infrastructural projects, and being capable to introduce all this into a domestic logic, into a domestic scale, to build a house with it.
Actually, the arrival to prefabrication techniques was a bit accidental. We went to visit a factory again to get an idea of how these structures are built, and we found in this first image that we were showing this kind of symmetry of elements that did not serve for any purpose, and we wanted to reuse them, and then we came with this idea of building a dance, a structural dance that could reflect then in the orchestration of the construction, but that would then build this space that goes around in the house as an helix. So everything in our work, whenever we are designing, we're always thinking how everything is going to come together, no? The structure, the space, the process, it's all part of the conception, as you will see over the presentation, how we build the models and how those models reflect our process of thinking.
And this video tells this story, how we design, and that connects in how we anticipate that design is going to be built. And there's a strange linkage between a conceptual approach as a designer and the industrial logic, the script that has to be developed to assembly and to put all these heavy pieces, heavy parts together.
So here we are decontextualizing, in a way, this technology. In Spain, we've seen it, and in many other countries, of course, but where we come from, we see it building highways, building channels, serving this infrastructural purpose, and we were trying to bring this scale into the domestic space, no? As well as also start to understand what does prefabrication mean and how can it bring some values into all this process of making architecture.
So everything starts with a reinterpretation of the part, of giving different meaning to what's a beam of pre-stressed concrete, a soulless object that contributes to the transmission of those mechanical stresses. We wanted to reinterpret all these architectonical language and to be able to trace a space that had a clear levity and characteristic that could respond as a house.
And we also found out in this project how everything, when we are dealing with elements that are fabricated off-site and arrive to the site, how everything has to be fully engineered, controlled to the millimeter, almost creating a kind of high-resolution architecture. So the design has to be absolutely processed so that when the performance of the construction arrives, there are not many surprises. Of course, in architecture and in construction, there are always some of them.
And by making, we were the contractors of this house, we discovered the usage of gravity as our main substance, how this house is defined by the presences of these big archetypical parts, the beam, the stone, the truss. And this became a game where creativity and engineering were chasing each other. And as artists or scientists, we discovered the strength of the structure to be the detonator of all the spatial emotion, the experience that ultimately is the goal of any architectural construct.
We like making the most of the tools with which we are working and building architecture. So typically, when the structure is finished, the space is already there, and it's just a question of completing, enclosing, thermally, and waterproofing the architecture so that it can serve the purpose for which we are building. And this is our house in Spain, and we like experimenting on ourselves before doing it with other people. This is where we live now part of the year because we moved to Boston. This is where we celebrate parties, and this was filmed during the World Cup in 2010 that happened in South Africa. I'm not going to remind the result of the World Cup, but and we were filming this actually for an exhibition that was done in Venice, created by García Abril, that was called People Meet in Architecture. So we wanted to show the way in which life happens in our home here.
So with this house, we learned to deal with weight, and we enjoy the capability of weight to produce very intense architectonical spaces. But we started our research in our lab at MIT, trying to maintain the weight as a presence, as a space, without the burdens of mass. So we built rocks that had no mass, beams that were able to span enormous lengths without having to lift them with heavy machinery. And this inspired us to produce a set of projects where the firmitas, the solidness were attributes, but they were ultralight in terms of their massivity.
So we are doing this research in Boston. Just when we displaced ourselves, we moved from Spain, from that amazing house you saw. And we arrived to Boston, and we had to find a place to live. And of course, for us, it had to be an opportunity to do something. So we found this ugly duckling in a nice neighborhood with very good public schools for our kids. So we decided to buy it, and it had a pretty solid construction, concrete block, and we lived there for 2 years while doing the project and also starting the conversations with the city.
So again, we stack beams, as you have already realized. No? But these beams had to be very, very light. Firstly, because we wanted to explore the off-site construction to the extreme. We built this in Madrid, and we shipped it to US. In US, everything arrives in boxes, so there was no big deal to bring the full house. So as part of the creative process, there's also a research that, as we mentioned, started. The science was inspired in our lab at MIT, but immediately we wanted to spin this off and build in the real world of the architecture with all the constraints and all the beauty of it. So we went back to Spain, set up a shop with students, young designers, non-skilled labor, and we made a workshop. So we are doers to the extreme, and we developed the craft and the systems to be capable to transport all this back to the United States.
And what's very interesting is that with the Hemeroscopium House, we were depending on a precaster, specific industry, but here we are managing to find a way to prefabricate these large-scale elements, but with really very basic tools and technologies that are available everywhere in the world. So we are doing it ourselves with our people in the workshop. You know? Again, researching and experimenting and allowing ourselves.
Believe me, you cannot wheel a beam like this if it's pre-stressed concrete. And you cannot even put it into a container box. So this is what, as architects, we wanted to explore, the capability of a building to ultimately be built out of the terrain with a different technology, hybridizing two traditions, no? The North American framing standard with the European, let's say, solidness and scale of these big chunks. No?
And just imagine this moment. When we had done prefabrication before, it was in Spain, more or less local, but here we were bringing these elements from Madrid in containers. It could not go wrong. No? They really needed to fit. And it was a very exciting moment. I think also for the neighbors, because as you can see, the fact that these elements are quite large makes the assembly process an easy one. Also, the crane is very reasonable, nothing to be worried about. So it was interesting to assemble the house in 7 days, like the 7 containers that were transporting these elements.
So all this transformation, all this development of this technology to be capable to produce a very interesting space embraced by all these walls, very open to nature, without the mass, but with all the comfort and all the solidness that a construction requires. This invited us and explored us to continue this process, to elevate it to a collective housing or to a problem that incorporated other variables within the city of Boston.
By the way, this is the secret of the space. No, it's what we call a multipurpose domestic, where we have all the functions in this one big room. No? It's not a big house, but the fact that all the space is given all the volume of the house is given to the same space, make it actually very monumental. No? So as Antón was saying, it's this idea of building with very locally available materials, very simple, understanding the logics of prefabrication, but actually understanding that the luxury of the house is in the space, is what we are now working at a larger scale. Again, this goes for the Gonsul architecture. This is after the construction of this Cyclopean House, a drawing from Alejandro. Dad is with a crane. Mom, I think this is a concrete truck. And this is Alejandro climbing up all the stairs.
So these systems have been pushed to the, I would say, the next level of complexity, the collective housing, the framing of all these individual differences that is our lives. No? Trying not to impose any kind of scheme or a program, because all of our lives are essentially identical. We have the same needs, but fundamentally different. No? So we understood that we as architects were just required to provide that basic platforms of space, infrastructure, without compromising the life of the users. So we applied all this logic, trying to generate the systemic, affordable, semi-automated construction system that could bring together into collective communities different ranges of income due to the industrialization of all the housing process.
So all that we have experienced building our houses, and especially this last one that we were showing, suddenly gets an immediate application into a larger scale, for a larger purpose as well.
So the idea of designing a building that contains people, no? And giving a strong identity to it through form or through materials was kind of pushing us away. No? We wanted the idea of a very flexible, stackable, free system of space that could give the user the ultimate voice, the ultimate word of customizing and finishing their own habitat. No? So we departed from these clear structural systems that could be automated, that could be done rapidly in a very affordable way. And we understood that this was the canvas where everybody should create their own lives.
And then, of course, because we've built our house and we know what it costs and also what it looks like it costs, we are very confident that we are able to take this kind of quality of the architecture into the scale of the collective housing, and we really believe that we are able to bring together different levels of income into the same architecture, reflecting, in a way, society.
And the next is to adapt all this logic into the urban scale. And here is where all the variability, the randomness of people is what really creates our cities. Just the such idea of trying to plan a city has been historically a great error. But the idea of introducing all these uncertain variables into the design process, as we are showing in this video, where all the Ensamble Studio was participating in this connectivity, in this assembly, without a programmed design. In this case, was the performative actions of all of us incorporating all the system of connections and structures.
Yeah, we are trying to, with these design processes where there are different minds building the architecture in a way with the same direction, but try to find this diversity in the spaces, also in the vertical structures, because I think there is a lot of imagination still to be placed into the way in which we build vertical structures versus the horizontal ones that, of course, because they are connected with the ground, they have different levels of transparency. But today, technology really allows to push those concepts.
And this is our vision of the city, this almost craziness of interactions, of different people, of tensions. We understood this as designers as a frame where all these activities could occur. The same idea that we did in our house, extended to collective housing, extended to the urban. The idea of flexibility, something that could be dismantled and redone again, required a particular scale and distribution of the structural parts that constitute the three-dimensional city.
So when Alejandro Aravena invited us to participate in the 2016 Venice Biennale, which had the title Reporting from the Front, he was asking us, like, what is the front you want to report to? And it's this vision of the city that needs to be more diverse, more creative in terms of its structures and its architecture, so that it can inspire that in the people that inhabit it. And that same vision has a counterpart in nature, because I think this is the pending conversation that we need to think. When we think of the city, we inevitably need to be designing also and thinking about the nature. And our position seems quite antagonic, maybe, and you will find out now, but for us it's completely related. When we look at nature, we want to learn from it, we want to build with it.
So this drives us to the site, to on-site. And on-site means to subdue to the logic of the site, to its history, to its memory, to its materiality. So we had the opportunity to build this project where we dug a hole as a first action on the site, introduce part of the vegetable, mineral, and animal participation of the site, as a process that broke the architectonical system tradition, but was perfectly embedded into the roots of the natural environment and the vernacular that we were dealing with. All this construct needed some energy given by a little cattle that we invited to participate in the carving process with the time that it needed and with a completely different set of rules that all the prefabrication, automatization madness that we have previously explained.
So if we were showing before this high-resolution architecture where everything needs to be absolutely controlled to the millimeter, with this other architecture, there is a moment where uncertainty plays a very important part, and we relinquish control.
So giving the time to nature to provide its own forms, we as architects were just interceding in the process, trying to comprehend the material consequences and the spaces that were given almost as a fruit after we were rooted into the terrain. So we understood that all this layering, almost magmatic layering of masses that we recreated as 3D printers, human 3D printers, like controlling all those layers that were casting slowly all the aggregation of the structure was part of a natural system that we were manipulating.
So again, this is another experiment where at the moment we didn't know exactly what we were looking for. We were just willing to experiment with concrete in its liquid form and seeing what kind of chemical reactions it could provoke with materials that were after completely local and available on the site.
But this was not yet architectonic process until we started making cuts, chops, carving, cleaning, and discovering all the extraordinary materialities that the process was offering us. Ultimately, we wanted to acquire a very strong emotional connection with the place. And this is through the material world, through the corporeality, through the body of the architectures that we are building.
So here is the moment where we have followed this recipe that has really no architectural plans that can help to build it. The cow has helped in this process of extracting all the material, and we're about to discover how the space is inside. Now, this is a moment of absolute excitement that I didn't really know that architecture could bring, no? To me and to us as designers. No? We didn't fully know that we could be surprised in such a way by our own process or our own works.
And Paulina the cow, and we named her Paulina in honor to Paulo Mendes da Rocha, just inhabited the space. We helped her retire all that hay, and all that dirt, all that hairy concrete, all that life that occurred during the full year that all this process came up, gave the structure an enormous soul and a very, very strong materiality. Here we discovered all these lives of concrete. No? It has this rough and finish encounter with the soil, or the cut with the diamond rope, or the petrified, almost sublime materialization of the distant sea, no? in the ground due to the hydrostatic pressure, the concrete over a plastic.
And building the Hemeroscopium House, we had not realized concrete could have such a richness in its texture, in its materiality, no? Which is something that in this learning process of testing our ideas and building them, it's kind of our best academy. And sometimes when we do these works for our own curiosity, we find great allies on the way. And this is the case of the last project that we are going to show, the last project that we have completed in Montana in an amazing landscape where Kathy and Peter Halstead, both amazing artists and more amazing clients, they reached to us to help them build an art center in this brutal, wild place. And with the concern, which they translated to us, that this architecture would not overwhelm the place and would really help people to connect with the land.
So here, as architects, we faced a grand dilemma. What do we do here, no? In this non-referential space with nothing but the most sublime, outstanding, untouched wilderness? So we decided to try to get rid of architecture and start from beginning, trying to understand the geological processes, the pressure, the forces of nature, like explosions or hydraulics or gravity, all these outstanding natural conditions that create our physical world that we try to dominate through architecture. In this case, we wanted them to be the action, the performative action that we just operated with.
So the project that we built, that we designed with our clients, became, instead of one building, a constellation of spaces, of these architectures that would develop this map on the site where each of these kind of open air rooms would encourage without fixing a different function. So each of these architectures, sometimes they have a specific properties or infrastructural nature to connect, or they actually connect with infrastructures existing on the site. So in a way, they are trying to understand the places where they are located and resonate with the landscape to make it inhabitable.
So the poetic approach to nature, to understand nature, was to bring to the material world all those resonances. For example, in this project, we wanted to bring physically and phenomenologically the presence of the mountains as space and also as acoustic space, to hear the mountains. In these three projects that are the ones that we built, we tried to serve the project, the program, the entrance, music room, but still make these long, almost spiritual connections with the terrain.
So the first two ones that we built very intelligently from the part of the client were, the smaller ones, the ones that would allow us, again, to test the ideas that we were proposing and seeing how they would fit on the site. No? And they are very symbolic in the way that they are situated in the access points, and they mark those landscapes. And the process of design, again, is from the model. We are working with our hands and thinking at the same time. We are producing these models, and then we scan them, and we extract all the information that we need for other purposes, like stamps and making it legal, and then, again, the process of construction becomes fundamental and is embedded even in those documents that we are producing. So we are creating the architecture, but we really have to come up with, especially in this remote place, with a feasible way of building them that matches also the poetry of the project. This project is about an architecture that is almost extracted, or a space that is almost extracted from the ground. So for us, it's very important that the process is able to convey that idea as well.
So all this letting the matter do ultimately the design, just manipulating slightly, had to be checked with a highly precise engineering control. So here's where we dealt with these two apparently disconnected process of the design thinking. First of all, we gave all the uncertainty, the value that requires, and the creativity, the liberty that needed, no formal predetermined departure to create that arch. But we controlled, as architects, as engineers, how all these surfaces, all these textures were providing this internal encounter of gravity and the birth of these architectures.
And here, we already know some things that we have learned building the Truffle. We already know, where we want a rough concrete that expands and extends the canyon, or where we want a shiny concrete that will reflect the clouds and will refer to the landscape in a different way. And these two doors, this is the other one inverted, which inverts the conditions. So the smooth surface is inside, the rough is outside, has a similar construction process, but then creates this other effect of reflecting or bringing in instead of the clouds like the previous one, the closer landscape of the earth.
We want to finish with the last of this structure of landscape, domo. Domo is the dome, it's a house, it's a cavern, it's a very archetypical space that has a cave shape but without the mountain. No? But ultimately we wanted to recreate those hills that generate the topography of the place and be able to use that space as a resonator. We went back to the model as a totemic performance action where we rehearse and we play and we discover everything that will be, let's say, upgraded and upscaled to the engineering side. But in this creative process, again, we honor the model as our first document that we have to interpret, we have to look at it with different angles, perspectives, and be able to transform it into an architecture in the proper human scale.
So the different scales of models refer also to the process in the design that we are in. So in this last one, we are already rehearsing how we are going to go to the site, like we are doing here, and we are going to actually perform and get this architecture built with those people that have to help us get it built.
So as you can see, all this game puts together our artist and sensibility approach to nature with a new developed technology that has to respond to that will. In this case, we compacted a thick bed of gravel that we borrowed from the roads that were built to access. And we use that, again, as an almost dry, open canvas where we could emulate the erosion that in the hills is given by time and wind. In this case, we used a retroexcavator and the previous models as a template, but not as a strict guide. So all this space between the uncertain, the matter that is going to impose its own forms, pressures, and textures, and the requirement to fully engineer all this thick and poderous structure is where we have been operating in this project.
And here, when we are already on the site, is when the ideas need to be translated and adjusted as needed to the local conditions, to the way in the materials available, the knowledge of the people, and also bring that knowledge into the project to enrich it and to make it possible. And then the weather. In this location, the weather is extreme. It was really difficult to have any control over the time of the construction because we are pouring concrete in winter time, so the temperatures dropped. And it is a project where we really realized we were, in a way, at the service of nature and its element. And it was quite beautiful to integrate that part into the process, because this architecture that, again, as in the Truffle, we are here discovering and unveiling almost like an archaeological structure. It wants to belong to nature. It wants to be appropriated. It is great if it changes with time. It is great when the snow changes the color or reflects on it. And it actually belongs in a strange way to the land, at the same time that it looks artificial. So it has this ambiguous condition between maybe art, landscape, architecture. It does serve the architecture purpose of reflecting and service as an acoustic space to have concerts and performances. But it can be completely alone. It doesn't need to have a function to exist. It doesn't look like an empty building, and it doesn't need to be maintained, which was very important given the scope of the project and the bigness of the site.
So ultimately, the message of architecture dealing with landscape is to serve all the needs that we have as humans. In this case, was providing shelter, an acoustical shell, and hosting concerts, open-air concerts. But I think there's a more profound ambition that has to do to make a very, very strong connection between the material world and our own human experience, our own capability to connect spiritually with the site.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.